Earlier generations often started families at a young age, regardless of whether their time was shaped by war, peace, inflation, or economic collapse. Generation Z, by contrast, is postponing parenthood even though it lives in an era defined by advanced technology and the highest levels of education in history. How can a more prosperous society produce less confidence in the future? Why are birth rates declining in a time filled with innovation and opportunity? And what does this reveal about the structure of our economic and social systems? That is exactly what we will examine now. Birth rates are declining worldwide. The fertility rate in the United States currently stands at about 1.6 children per woman. Canada and much of Western Europe range between 1.4 and 1.6. Japan and Italy are around 1.3. South Korea has fallen below 1.0, one of the lowest birth rates ever recorded in a developed country. Different cultures, different political systems, the same demographic trend. Public debate often frames this shift as a lifestyle choice or as an expression of generational self-absorption. Historical data, however, tells a structural story. Birth rates follow economic conditions. To understand the current decline, we must analyze labor markets, housing costs, student debt, income stability, and long-term economic expectations. A look into the past shows how families made decisions under comparable economic conditions. For most of human history, children were not a luxury but a central part of a family's economic system. In agricultural communities and early industrial cities, they worked alongside adults. Economic history studies from 19th century Philadelphia show that children in working-class households contributed between 28 and nearly 46% of total household income. In some families, children earned nearly half of what the household lived on. In that environment, a large family was an investment with low risk and high return. More children meant more income and greater security. With the spread of industrialization, however, this basic logic was turned upside down. Laws against child labor and the introduction of compulsory education did more than change childhood. They completely reversed the economic structure of the family. Children were no longer short-term contributors to household income. Instead, they became a long-term financial investment. The economic equation of family formation was fundamentally rewritten. As industrialization expanded, governments restricted child labor. School attendance became mandatory. Families moved to cities where housing was smaller and more expensive. Children no longer generated income. Instead, they required years of financial support before entering the labor market. By the early 20th century, birth rates had already begun to decline, especially in middle and higher income households. Census data shows that families with higher education and higher income reduced their family size earlier than others. They adapted their decisions to the new cost structure. This pattern continues today. Raising a child is now one of the largest long-term financial commitments a household can make. Earlier estimates by the U.S. Department of Agriculture placed the cost of raising a child to age 18 at over $230,000 for middle-income families. When current housing and healthcare costs are included, more recent estimates in many regions exceed $300,000. This amount represents nearly 2 decades of expenses: housing, food, healthcare, transportation, clothing, and education. Childcare adds additional pressure. Research by the Brookings Institution shows that infant care costs between $10,000 and $15,000 per year in many U.S. states. In large cities, it can exceed $20,000 annually. In several states, childcare costs more than tuition at a public university. These costs exist alongside limited incomes. According to U.S. Census data, people between the ages of 25 and 34 earn a median income of roughly $45,000 to $55,000 per year. At the same time, raising a child to age 18 represents, depending on region and living standards, roughly 30 to 40% of an annual salary. When lifetime child-related expenses reach several $100,000 while annual income remains limited, families weigh these numbers carefully. Housing plays a central role in this calculation. Data from the Federal Reserve shows that median home prices in the United States have more than doubled since the early 2000s. In Canada, cities such as Toronto and Vancouver rank among the least affordable housing markets in the world relative to income. In the United Kingdom, official statistics show persistent affordability problems, particularly in major metropolitan regions. The first structural illusion is the security illusion. Public narratives often describe Gen Z as less resilient or less willing to take on long-term responsibility. The data suggests a different reality. Earlier generations, especially those in the post-war period, entered adulthood in an environment defined by rising real wages and relatively affordable housing. Today, income growth has become disconnected from housing costs. Rent and home prices are rising faster than purchasing power. Under these conditions, postponing parenthood is not a sign of reduced ambition, but a rational risk calculation in a more volatile asset market. The second structural illusion is the education return illusion. Student debt further changes the equation. The U.S. Federal Reserve reports total student loan balances exceeding $1.7 trillion. Many borrowers pay between $300 and $600 per month. In the United Kingdom and Australia, repayment systems are income dependent, yet they still slow wealth accumulation during critical life stages. Gen Z is the most formally educated generation in modern Western history. At the same time, the cost of education has increased significantly while the income advantage of academic degrees has declined in many industries, a phenomenon often described as credential inflation. Young adults invest more heavily in their human capital, but begin their careers with higher financial risk and lower relative returns. The narrative of the perpetual student obscures this economic recalibration. Higher initial investments with a smaller margin of security. When rent, insurance, transportation, food, debt repayments, and childcare are considered together, the financial space for long-term planning shrinks considerably. At its core, the issue is financial capacity and perceived stability. The third structural illusion is the stability illusion. This capacity is closely tied to labor markets. Data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that younger workers experience higher job turnover rates and more frequent underemployment. Entry-level positions often already require prior experience. Contract and freelance work offer flexibility but reduce long-term predictability. OECD data shows similar patterns in Western Europe, where youth unemployment consistently exceeds the overall unemployment rate. Critics often interpret Gen Z's focus on work-life balance as self-centeredness. Structurally, however, long-term institutional guarantees, stable pension systems, predictable career paths, and employer loyalty have weakened. Temporary contracts, gig work, and project-based employment have increased. When long-term security cannot be structurally guaranteed, prioritizing immediate well-being is not psychological fragility, but an adaptive response to systemic uncertainty. History shows this relationship clearly. During the Great Depression, birth rates in the United States fell by more than 20% between the late 1920s and the mid-1930s. Marriage rates also declined. Economic uncertainty shaped private decisions. After World War II, governments invested heavily in infrastructure, housing, and education. The GI Bill expanded access to higher education. Mortgage programs made home ownership affordable for millions. Stable industrial jobs offered predictable incomes. Between 1946 and 1964, about 76 million children were born in the United States. Canada, Australia, and parts of Western Europe experienced similar patterns. Demographers attribute this period of higher birth rates to broad access to stable employment and affordable housing. Education also influences the timing of family formation. Longer educational pathways delay entry into stable full-time employment. According to data from the CDC, the average age at first birth in the United States has risen from around 21 years in 1970 to about 27 today, often above 30 among women with university degrees. A later start shortens the biological window for having multiple children and lowers total fertility. Surveys from the American Psychological Association, the Pew Research Center, and Eurobarometer show elevated economic concerns among younger adults in Western democracies. Climate change, geopolitical instability, political polarization, and rapid technological change further intensify uncertainty. Having a child is one of the most irreversible decisions a person can make. The decline in birth rates is not a cultural shift, but the logical echo of an economic instability that has replaced security with risk.